Guys, I'm here with Danny Martin, since we're probably going to put it on his podcast. But we are here to discuss prospects in MMA. We have a patron question, and I will read that out in a minute as soon as I find the patron question. Okay. It's from...
Wasting no time.
Yeah. Let nobody say that I wasn't prepared.
Truly.
It's from Kylan Komalt. I probably said that wrong, but I say every name wrong, so it doesn't matter. How do you determine who you think are the hot young prospects in MMA? What specific criteria do you look for in a fighter you're watching for the first time? Okay, so I figure we'll start off by talking about, we'll directly answer the question and say what we look for, and then we might transition into like a more wider scope discussion of how prospects work in MMA. So Danny, what are the main things you look for in a prospect?
Well, this is a good question, and it's a pretty broad one because oftentimes at least when it comes to the UFC specifically, Ryan and I have talked about this extensively, that the UFC is really not a place for prospects to develop.
Yep.
It is a place for finished products to compete against one another. If you notice, it's very hard to find examples of fighters being given the right matchmaking in the UFC to develop as a prospect, and B, actually being able to make good on that and improve over time. And these are detailed observations that we'll probably get to more a little bit later. To answer the specific question, what do we look for in a prospect? Generally, what I look for is I want to see that a prospect has a functioning system as a fighter. It may not be the deepest and it may not be the most detailed, but I need to see what their process is. If you're going to be a striker, I need to see, what are your main weapons? What are your ancillary weapons? What do you do to control the exchanges? Are you a counter striker? Are you, do everything off a lead? How's your pace? Can you push a pace that you can keep? Can you push a pace that you can't keep? How might you translate over 5 rounds? If your plan A doesn't work, what about your plan B? If you're a grappler, I need to see, how do you get your kind of engagement? How do you get wrestling exchanges, out of thin air? Are you a shot wrestler? Are you, just fishing for a single and trying to make something out of it? Are you kind of a Brian Ortega type where you're, sort of walk into the clinch and work for like a snap down? There are a bunch of different ways to be a prospect, in MMA. There are a lot of different, ways that you can win fights in MMA, obviously. But I think for me, when I'm looking for young fighters, I need to see what your system is. Ryan, how does that sound?
Yeah, that aligns almost perfectly with what I was going to say. Like Danny said, the most important thing I think is process, because everything else you can learn. You can be taught how to box. You can be taught how to defend takedowns. You can also be taught how to think and how to go about winning fights, but it's a lot harder, and it's not something that all camps and all coaches are equipped to teach you. So the most important thing I look for in somebody who's young and not developed yet is, do they know what they want to do, and do they understand themselves as a fighter? Because MMA is inundated right now with guys who are very good at certain things but don't know how to link those into a coherent system. Even at very high levels, like somebody like Calvin Kattar, who's an amazing boxer and has very good discrete skills, but he's not gonna figure out how to win matchups that are difficult for him. He can't cut off the cage, and as long as his opponent doesn't go away and he's struggling to do that, he isn't going to just suddenly develop a new way to force engagements. So I need to see that process. What are the guy's A game? And more importantly than that, how does he go about ensuring that the fight stays in the phases where he wants it? So I think that is a lot more important than just being skilled, because you can have a lot of discrete skills in certain phases, even in all phases. But if you don't understand yourself as a fighter, and you don't have that kind of flowchart system thing where you know how to get to the positions you want, you know how to force the fight into the areas that you're going to win it, then you can be if you've read Danny's metagame piece, the first one you wrote about how I think that one was about how I forget exactly, but it it talks about how you can overcome a skill deficit by just like coherence, right? And by having a
Yeah.
system and doing what you need to do and knowing what you need to do. I think that's the most important thing for a prospect.
Yeah.
Um,
I would argue that like I would be you kind of have to evaluate prospects in their early careers by what you see. And like in some ways, like the lessons, you can't be too quick to write off a prospect. Like an example that, that comes to mind is like Burgos Cater, where, Burgos was a much younger fighter than Cater in terms of age and fight years. And he had a very good performance despite losing. And it's a fight you can look at and be like, well, like did Burgos just fall apart? Not really. He kind of lost the fight, doing what he'd been doing the whole time, and he really got kind of figured out by a more experienced fighter. And that I think is a promising like a more promising way to look at a prospect, and even if they've lost, and you can be like, okay, you can still build from that, I think. Um, but it's hard to like we're not coaches obviously, but it's hard to teach fighters a system because there are so many different ways that a fight can go south in MMA. I had a conversation with Phil McKenzie after Holloway Volkanovski, and he said like one of the things, when you evaluate certain fighters, you sort of have to think like how many different kinds of fighters have I seen this fighter beat? And that is a really useful question when you're evaluating any fighter, but especially in terms of prospects, because sometimes prospects will get matchups that are designed to make them look good, or even they're supposed to be like tough but winnable matches, and all that's important, but you also have to kind of think like, have I seen this this pressure boxer deal with, a strong reactive takedown threat, or have I seen them against a an outside kicker who's threatening in the clinch, or whatever it might be. There's just a bunch of different there's a lot of different possibilities of styles out there that it may be even difficult to garner experience against.
yeah, I agree. And a lot of regional fighters and regional promotions, they're not really equipped to like give you that insight into fighters. So you get a lot of them like Curtis Millender, where he fights a lot of strikers early in the UFC, and he looked
Oh yeah.
impressive, impressive-ish outside the UFC, and then it just turns out he can't grapple at all.
Yeah.
I think you can trust Russian prospects a lot better. Not only because we've talked a lot about ACA and the fight site, but not only are the fighters just really solid overall, but they can all grapple, they can all work in transitions. Like the Russian regional scene has a shocking talent for transitional work. And fighters coming up there, if you're going to succeed, you need to be able to deal with that. So I think you can usually trust like high level Russian prospects quite a bit more. But if they're like a European fighter, they can sometimes have these weaknesses that you don't notice until they start fighting good competition, and that they don't get addressed. In terms of what we were talking about process and how we think that's the most important thing we look for in a prospect. In terms of what that would look like on a more granular level, like if you have a pressure fighter, I want to see how he enforces his pressure game. Like a lot of pressure fighters kind of get the fight they want early in their careers, where guys will kind of run away from them. Uh,
Yeah.
they know they're power punchers and they don't want to get hit.
Yep.
But when they're fighting guys who don't want to do that, who want to stand there and punch with them, how do they make them back up? Can they jab him back to the cage? Will they go to the clinch and then physically push him back? Do they have a wrestling threat that allows them to move forward with impunity? For wrestlers, how are their entries? How did they use their striking to set up their takedowns? And how does that wrestling take away their opponent's striking? Like, how do they use it to counter? their opponent's striking. Um, in terms of discrete skills, like rather than concepts like coherence and process, what do you think are some of the more important discrete granular skills for a fighter to have for a prospect?
Well, I generally like to see some kind of defensive awareness from a prospect. I realize, as I've said myself, and Ryan has too, that defense tends to be the last thing that fighters develop. Obviously, you can't. It's hard to
Right before
expect.
their careers end.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like in the fourth chapter of their, it's you see that a lot.
Sucks that
Um,
Aldo waited until he was shot to develop defense,
that's
doesn't it?
right. That's correct, Ryan. Um, yeah, no, but seriously, like I don't expect you to be Jose Aldo from your first go round. You probably haven't had, with 10 fights, you probably even haven't even had that much in cage experience to really employ that. But I want to see that you have some idea of what your defense is. Like, if you look at a prospect like Zabit when he was coming up, he always had a decent sense of his own range. He did a good job of obstructing guys coming in. He had good cage craft where he would kind of feint both directions and then commit to one as an opponent stepped in. Like, he's not winning any defensive awards, but it's solid awareness from a young fighter that says, okay, you can probably build on this going forward, and this is probably going to insulate you enough from some potentially dangerous matchups that, more reckless prospects who think I can't lose, as you see sometimes, just the overconfident, invincible prospect, um, they just may not have. So that's something I look for. I want to see your footwork. Like as Ryan said, like when fighters develop pressure games, it may take a while to develop that correct kind of pressuring footwork as opposed to just sort of walking an opponent down. Um, I like to see like I said, what your main weapon is. If you're working off a jab, what kind of jab do you have? How do you employ it? Um, if you're a wrestler, it's nice to see like several different entries. Like if making sure that you can get the fight where you want it in a multitude of different ways. If you're Chad Mendez and your favorite entry is like a blast double, it's also very nice to see him, chain wrestle some guys where if he misses a double, he might switch to a single and then switch back to the double and just continue chaining until he has guys down. I'd say variety is probably an important skill with your weapons. What about you, Ryan?
I think the most important skills for me are like cage awareness, ring craft,
Yep.
boxing, and transitional awareness. So the ring craft is something that fucks over a lot of otherwise excellent fighters, and it's like a systemic issue in MMA, not just because MMA fighters are bad or because they're not very good at striking, which is true. The striking level in MMA is not great, but there's a lot of stuff that goes into this. So if you walk into even a high level MMA gym, you're not going to see a lot of people like sparring in real size octagons. You're probably not even going to see that many people sparring on ring in a ring. You're going to see a lot of people like cramped into like an open space mat. And if it's a busy day, if it's there's nobody there and there's just like a couple people doing practice, maybe they'll have a lot of room to move around. If it's busy, they'll have like their own little square, and they'll just have to stay in that square and like just punch each other. But there's not a lot of great opportunities to work on your ring craft in normal MMA training. Most of the sparring takes place on mats, and mats are really bad for developing your awareness of a fighting space that is nothing like a mat. Um, and when they are training inside a closed space environment, if they're lucky enough to have the area to themselves and they're not squished in there with other people, it's usually a smaller ring or like a small octagon that isn't regulation size. So aside from just not developing these skills a lot, it's kind of hard as an MMA fighter to be able to consistently train these skills. And that's something that bites a lot of them in the ass when they get up to the UFC level. Not only because of the training, but when you see regional fights, the cages are often really small. And you see a lot of guys get into the UFC and the octagon is huge, and they don't really know how to navigate it, their opponent, they'll come forward and try to punch him, and he can just back up. And if it's a pressure fighter who's got a pretty solid pressure game and knows how to cut off the cage, it might not be as much of an issue. But if it's somebody who's used to like an open space boxer, and their opponent can just keep backing up over and over again, it can really throw them off, especially if they're fighting somebody who actually has an idea of circling and lateral movement and all that. So if a fighter can get that out of the way before they're in there for the first time in the big octagon and fighting somebody who knows how to navigate it, I think that's a really good sign. And conversely, if somebody struggles with that, if you see them continually forget about their ring positioning or cage positioning and get backed up to the fence, it's a bit of a red flag. Boxing, I think, because it's the most important skill for striking on the feet. The level of kicking skill in MMA is really low, and guys who are good kickers often have games that kind of like disregard other skills. So you'll see a lot of guys who are primarily kickers, who don't have the best footwork and navigate boxing exchanges mostly by trying to avoid them rather than being competent there and like being able to hold their own. So I think having a good boxing game for a prospect is probably one of the more important signs for striking success. And this goes for wrestlers too. Like if somebody's a grappler, I want to see how they box, because once they get into the UFC and start fighting people who are more often than not competent defensive wrestlers, they aren't just going to be able to shoot outright. They're not just going to be able to sit at range and take naked shots. They're going to need to set up their takedowns with their punches, or they're going to need to counter their opponent's punches with their takedowns. And then finally, transitional work. This is, I think, probably more important in the lower divisions, both because there tends to be more transitions in grappling exchanges and clinch exchanges there, and also because the divisions are just better, and high level transition work is usually something that happens between like very skilled fighters. So if a fighter is, like I was saying before, if they have a lot of skills in discrete areas, they're good at boxing, they're good at wrestling, but they can't link them together, that can be a real problem against when they start getting up into higher levels and fighting people who are prepared to do that. So again, if a fighter can get that out of the way early, and I can see in their early career that they have an idea of how to use the different phases of their game to increase the efficiency and efficacy of both, then it's a lot easier to have confidence in them moving forward.
Yeah.
So I think for as far as discrete skills go, those are the most important to me. Do you want to talk a little bit about like the life cycle of careers in MMA right now?
Oh, sure. But before I do, you actually brought up a really interesting point that I wanted to highlight, is that when you talked about cagecraft, and sort of, ring generalship, it's something that's hard to teach because they may not get experience, doing that in training. It is notable that the first two that come to mind for me, the first two examples, one of whom has great cagecraft and the other of whom is a great pressure fighter, Eddie Alvarez and Peter Yan. It is notable that these two fighters came into doing that after a lot of 5-round experience with, equally skilled opponents at the high levels.
Yes.
Um, like these are guys who, Eddie, it took time for Eddie to develop like the craft that he had in the second Michael Chandler fight. Um, but he's also someone who has spent tons and tons of time in the ring and in the cage fighting a bunch of different kinds of opponents. And like you will learn on the job as you do that. And that is like Eddie is like the prime example of that. And for Peter Yan, like Ed, our good friend and editor Ed Gallo has brought up that Peter Yan was not fighting scrubs early in his career. Like when he fought
They don't
Magomed
do that in
Magomedov.
CP.
No, you really don't. Like who was it? Was it Magomed Magomedov? That was the guy.
Magomedov, yeah.
Yep. When he fought him twice early in his career, he lost one split decision over 5 rounds and then won a pretty clear decision over 5 rounds. That's a lot of time that he spent in the cage learning how to play his own game, learning how to fix the flaws and like, what works, what doesn't. And that's just something that a lot of prospects just don't have that kind of experience. So I think that's a really astute observation, Ryan. As far as life cycles in MMA, they seem to be getting shorter, do they not?
Yeah, I think you get these weird guys like that are kind of journeymen early in their careers and they aren't facing elite fighters consistently and they can last longer than usual. Like Jorge Masvidal has been there for like I don't know 15 years or something, and
Yeah.
he's still strong. But guys don't last all that long at the top, and so I think the like prospect phase is around 1 to 5 years, and then year 6 to 7 are usually when they're starting to come into their prime and starting to kind of solidify the fighter they're going to become. When in the 1 to 5 year stage, they're still probably making big leaps between fights. So they'll come in with like entirely new skills, or they'll have sharpened something up a lot, or they'll have completely patched up a weakness between fights. And then in the 6 to 7 year stage, um, they're becoming the fighter that they're going to stay. They can still make improvements. They can maybe add new tools, sharpen up the existing ones, but probably not going to just like develop new things out of nowhere unless they're Jose Aldo. Um, I mean, how far was he into his career when he just like developed one of the best jabs in the sport randomly for the first Frankie Edgar fight?
Oh
That was
yeah, no, I'm like it's rare.
yeah, you don't see
It's not
that
a
a
common
lot.
thing.
And actually, before I keep going on with this, I think one of the things we skipped by, probably because it was obvious to us and we didn't think to point it out when we were talking about what we look for in a prospect, athleticism. I mean, like that is maybe the most important thing. Bringing up Jose Aldo made me think of that. But
I was gonna
if
make
you
a joke
don't,
about it. I was about to joke that like, yeah, just be a great athlete. That's really that'll do
I
like
mean, it's
70% of your work.
it's true though. Like there's almost a level of skill that's inaccessible to people who aren't great athletes.
Yeah,
Like if you
yeah.
watch the stuff that GSP, Aldo, Mighty Mouse are doing that other fighters can't, you don't develop that unless you have that athletic capability. Like Jose Aldo is such a good defensive fighter because his not only his reaction speed, but he's fast as fuck. He hits super hard, so he can back guys off easily. Like if you punch like I don't know who's the guy who uh Chris Gritzmacher. If you punch like Chris Gritzmacher, you can have amazing defense, but they'll just swarm you because you're not offering much of a threat. But yeah, so you really need to be athletic to compete at the highest level, and athleticism can not only is a lot easier to learn skills when you're athletic, but it can patch over weaknesses really easily. Like Dominic Reyes is not that great of a fighter. If you put him like if he was in a strong division, he really wouldn't be much. I don't think, at least not at this stage. He's still early and he can still develop a lot. But he's athletic as fuck. Like when Jones was deep in on his hips trying to take him down, Reyes doesn't have good takedown defense. He was just being an athlete, and that was kind of enough. I mean, it was
Yeah.
enough to beat Jones. But yeah, so athleticism is one of the most important things for determining how successful a prospect can be.
And
But
with athleticism, it can impact your train. Well, I mean, not can, it does impact your training. For guys who are insane athletes, I'm thinking like a Henry Cejudo type or a Yoel Romero type who are just at the complete, one polar end of the athletic spectrum, the high end. There's a greater chance that they can just spend a lot of their lifespan as a fighter in training and be more accustomed to that environment. Like these are guys who wrestled at the Olympic level and then turned into, elite MMA fighters. Like they can spend, they know both mentally and physically what it's going to require in training, to pull things off that just like you said, other fighters just can't do. And so it's hard to, you can't always bank on that. There are great athletes in MMA who don't who clearly don't put in the same kind of effort
yeah,
in their training.
absolutely.
Like that's, you can't excuse that. That's not what we're saying, but it can make a difference if you are ready for it to make a difference. And once they do, both Romero and Cejudo have, put on these insane strides, these insane performances that you look back a few years and be like how did we expect that from you? How did we expect that from what we had in 2012? and we're seeing what you can do in like 2019. It's in some ways they almost don't even connect, right?
Yeah. And continuing on the discussion about life cycles. So years 6 to 7 are when they're starting to get into their prime, and the improvements are starting to become smaller. And then after that, they're usually in the later stage of their careers where they're not making like big improvements between fights. Um, it takes a pretty exceptional fighter to make big changes to their game that late in their career. Sometimes they'll come through like a move in weight classes where it's just a different dynamic, but most fighters aren't really able to meaningfully add skills that late in their career. And so you were talking about how the UFC is not the place for prospects. Most of
Yep.
the people who you would think of as prospects who are in the UFC are kind of going into that later stage where they're starting to come into their prime and solidifying the fighter they've already become. Like if I think of the quote unquote prospects that I'm most interested in the UFC. They're like Ronnie Barcelos, Shane Burgos, Julio Arce, guys like that who are like 7 years into their career. They're not like getting a lot better between fights. There's probably an effect where you're starting to fight better competition than you have before that you can get used to that and kind of like learn how to beat the high level guys, but they aren't becoming completely different fighters. And I would say at this point they're probably not really prospects. It's just that we don't know what their ceiling is yet because they haven't been getting those kind of fights yet. And that leads me to my next point, which is the UFC is, like you said, a really bad place for prospects to develop. Not only like if you're brought in early, you'll get a lot of rough matchups. Not rough in terms of like fighting high level guys, but just fighters that are a lot more put together and solid than you would find in the regional scenes. So you don't get a chance to like to dominate and really develop your skills. Because some of the best fights for prospects are either the fights that they can play with and like really learn what works because they have a guy who's basically a blank slate that they can experiment on, or fights where a guy challenges them a lot in one specific way, but doesn't have the
Mm-hmm.
overall game to beat them. And when you're starting to fight in the UFC, like Sage Northcutt would run into guys like Brian Barberena, who's not like great, but he's tough as fuck. He's gonna stay there no matter what you do to him. And you're not just gonna, unless you're great at one thing, you're not going to just easily beat him there. And guys like Northcutt aren't equipped to handle him, aren't equipped to
Yeah.
handle those guys who are put together like that. And conversely, if you are well put together, then there's a very good chance you won't get the fights you need to bring you to like the next level until it's kind of too late. If you look at certain divisions are worse about this than others. Like welterweight is absolutely awful for getting their prospects up and fighting high level guys. Guys like Zaleski dos Santos, Li Jingliang have to wait until really late in their careers to start getting those steps up, and it's just a constant like stream of really tough mid level guys. So they get into these brawls against other mid level welterweights, and there's never really an opportunity to rise above. And it's compounded by awful matchmaking, where the UFC, when somebody deserves a step up, they can often be reluctant to get them.
Yeah. I think that I agree with pretty much everything you said, and I'd extrapolate on one specific point, which is that sometimes when you're early in your careers, you're a prospect in the UFC. Like I'm going to use Mike Perry as an example. His first fight was against Hyung-Yu Lim, I think, and he knocked him down like 3 times. He had him in like a mounted crucifix or something, and then finished him in the first round. Like it was just this, pretty much did everything that you could possibly want to see out of a prospect in their first performance. But I think after that, the UFC looked at Mike Perry and was like, "Oh, cool. Here's an exciting action fighter. Let's
Yeah,
give him exciting action fights only." And so he fought, I don't have the record in front of me, but I know he fought like Danny Roberts and Alan Jouban and like Santiago Ponzinibbio, um, Max Griffin, Vicente Luque. Like he just fought. He went through the ringer with this like Yeah, and like Paul Felder even. Like he fought this like ringer of big, tough, athletic bangers who, like I said, he put on a lot of fun fights and he was a fun action fighter, but he never really got a chance to get better. And and again, I don't know his training situation. From what we've heard, it's a little lackadaisical. There's a chance he may not have ever improved anyway, but like there is something to the effect of seeing what he could do early and then seeing, recently he just got cold clocked by Jeff Neal and pretty much looks like a shot fighter 4 years into his career. Like that's the problem too, is that the UFC might see you for something and then think that like that's all you're gonna be. And then the only way to really combat that is if you can win these fights consistently without taking too much damage,
I
like a
think more
max
than
weight.
winning, I think you got to be like, you have to appeal in some way to what the UFC wants to do. Like winning isn't enough.
That's
If you look
true.
at like
That's true.
Vicente Luque, like he loses to Michael Graves in his first fight, beats three guys that aren't great, and then he fights Bilal Muhammad and knocks him out in the first round. So okay, he gets a step up, loses to Leon Edwards, and then his next fight, Nico Price and Chad Laprise, he beats the shit out of both of them. Why is he getting guys like Jalen Turner, Brian Barberena, and Derek Krantz? Why are those fights
Mhm.
even happening? You have to. Then you look at someone like Corey Sandhagen in bantamweight. So he gets one fight against Austin Arnett, who's like a jobber. He beats him up impressively, and then right away he gets Yuri Alcantara, who's not like an elite fighter, but he's an interesting veteran at least. And in both of those fights, he didn't just win them, but he looked like flashy. He looked cool. Did like the kind of like neo footwork shifting stuff that I don't know that gets Dana's dick hard. And then 2 fights later, he gets John Lineker.
Yeah.
So I
And
think
that's
you have to win specifically in the way that they want you to.
yeah. And that's why it's so hard for prospects to actually not just do well, but actually even develop. Like, I'm gonna bring up Zabit again because I think he's a good example. Like Zabit is someone who actually has gotten, in my opinion, a decent a decent prospect path. Like
Mm-hmm.
he's an example of a fighter that the UFC didn't hardball from the moment that he had gotten an impressive win.
And they also didn't
Um,
softball him.
Right, exactly. So they gave him, I think he's undefeated in the UFC. So they gave him, whoever it was, Mike Santiago first, and then was it Shaman Moraes next?
Shaman.
And, yeah, and
Yes.
finished him, which was, solid win. He had a scrappier win over
Bosniak.
Bokniak, thank you. Like, okay, there's something here, and then he got a bit of a step back after that. Okay, it's fine. He had the Stevens fight. He looked okay. Won clearly. Didn't look amazing. And then he had another step up against Cater and looked good. And then again, kind of had similar issues. But he's like, I like what they've done with him because they've actually given him a chance to shine, to get some showcase wins. And they've given him some actual challenging matchups that
And he's
he's
on a clear upward progression. Like next he's probably gonna get a
right.
guy like Ortega where he's preparing for a title shot.
Yeah, and that could be tough, but it also could be winnable. Like
He's
it's
getting prepared to lose a 5 round fight. That's what they're doing to
yeah,
him right now.
and if he does, like, then that's fine. I hope they look at that, say, okay, he lost his first 5 round fight. Let's give him Shane Burgos, or let's give him, who's another like top 10 featherweight. I'm not even sure. Julio Arce would be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Like let's kind of keep him moving along this path because it makes sense. He has a lot of promise as a fighter, and he clearly isn't quite at that absolute title challenger ready to go level.
Right.
But that's rare, right? Like Zabit is a rare example of that. Who can you think of some examples of like prospects who, for one reason or another, just like haven't had a chance or just haven't bothered to show any improvement from fight to fight, and it's actually kind of led them into some traps.
I think there's a lot of like the welterweight examples we've covered already. Um, none are coming to mind at the moment, but I think there's quite a few. There's like obviously we've talked about Perry, Luque. Um, I don't know what's going on with Ponzinibbio, but I think he's like a different case because he's not
Yeah, he
he
just
again
he just isn't
it's his fault.
competing. Yeah.
But if you look at his career, it's still kind of he only got the step up against Gunnar Nelson after beating like okay, so he beats Sean Strickland, which is a very clear you deserve a step up fight. Gets a step up against Larkin, loses that, and then he gets impressive wins, finishes some dude in the first round, and then finishes Court McGee. Then he gets like Zach Cummings and Nordine Taleb, which are like fine, but they're kind of like lateral moves. They
Yeah.
do that a lot. Like a lot of prospects seem to get more and more often either given steps back or lateral moves, and there doesn't seem to be like a clear reason to it. Like if you look at other sports, like especially boxing, the way they develop prospects, they have the prospects development in mind with the matches they make. But in MMA, it seems more they match make. I was gonna say they match make like with excitement in mind in first at first, but I don't think they do. I think UFC matchmaking has just gotten more and more dog shit over the last few years, and
Yeah.
they aren't even really making exciting matchups consistently anymore. A lot of what they do is feeding exciting prospects just fodder, that either feeding them guys that shouldn't be in there with them or matching them up with other guys who are on the way up when both could probably be served better by giving them steps up against already established guys instead of throwing them against each other.
Yeah.
And I
The
think
fighter that,
go
oh,
ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
I think that's something MMA really lacks, like consideration for building a prospect through matchmaking.
Yeah. In that kind of like regarding what you just said, an example that comes to mind, and this might just be a heavyweight thing, but it is Francis Ngannou. Because Francis Ngannou is an example of what happens to a prospect when they just decimate everyone that's in front of them on the way up. They get to the very top, and then are there are big, like massive, glaring holes in their game that they may not even realize were there. And then, in their bounce back, they just kind of keep winning with what they were winning with in the first place. So, he's not like I haven't seen any notable improvement from Ngannou since like the Arlovsky fight. Like he won the Arlovsky fight and the Overeem fights in pretty much the exact same way. Got dominated by Stipe, went out there and lost one of the worst fights ever against Derek Lewis, who didn't hit him. And then he bounces back against Blades, Kane, and JDS. But again, I don't see what he's done differently as a prospect. And I think the fact that he's ostensibly having success, even if it's with the same tools, like that's just kind of reinforcing to him what I'm doing is the game.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm training with, how I'm fighting, this is the right way to fight. And then it may be Stipe. I realize Stipe is looking kind of old, but like it may be Stipe again. It may be hell even like Rosenstruik if someone just feints at him and just kicks his legs from a distance. Has he
Wait, he can
shown
also do leg kicks now, Danny. Haven't you seen him do leg kicks?
who has done leg kicks?
And Ngannou.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He showed a leg kick against Blades. But seriously, like the question is still there. Like, is that going to change anything? Like, if he encounters another sort of fighter who can just approach him with a little bit of tact, like, there's no guarantee that he's not going to lose that matchup again. And
I think
that's
that is. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just like to wrap it up. That's kind of an example of a prospect development gone wrong, where I don't even know how much he's improved upon the gaps in his game, and I definitely haven't seen him um like demonstrate anything else in his skill set.
I think that is a little bit of a heavyweight thing. I think generally the hyper athletic prospects who shoot up to the top in the first 5 years or so of their career are usually okay, but with heavyweight, like with most divisions, they'll be a little bit green, but they'll use their athleticism to overcome that. But on the way up, they'll have to face enough challenging matchups that they'll be forced to develop enough, and forced to learn like more nuance in their game, and forced to like develop their process more. Guys like Henry Cejudo, if you look at when he was really early into his career, he was beating guys like UCA Formiga, and he didn't look that good as a fighter. He was just super athletic, but he didn't just go away. He like when he fought guys like Joseph Benavidez, he struggled a bit, but he was still there. Um, and divisions like flyweight, bantamweight, featherweight, all the way up to like middleweight, force those guys to kind of learn how to fight on a higher level. You can't get to the top of like flyweight or bantamweight unless you're an actually good fighter as well as like an athletic dynamo. But heavyweight, you don't have to be good to be heavyweight. You
That's
just
true.
really just have to be. If you're a super athlete, you can just go out and punch them. And it's with Ngannou, it's not much more complicated than that. So I think that a lot of that is just down to heavyweight not having guys who force those kind of prospects to learn. Um, uh, I wanted to make another point, but I forgot what it was while I was talking about that.
Ngannou got
Do
you
you have
shook, dude.
anything? Do you have anything to add while I'm trying to remember what I was going to say?
Yeah, I would agree that is kind of a heavyweight thing, but I do think he's just a worthwhile example to consider that like he's an example. Okay, here's a better one. Um, is like Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley was mostly just a whoa. You all right?
Did I cut out?
No, that was just super loud. What was that?
I didn't do anything. Did something happen?
It just sounded like a bunch of breathing. Well, hopefully our listeners don't mind too much. Um, Tyron Woodley is an example of someone who, like in the Strikeforce scene, he was just a right hand and a takedown, and he's still just a right hand and a takedown. But he's learned to, I hate that I'm complimenting Tyron Woodley, but he did learn to fight, be a little bit more conservative. He learned how to deny exchanges better. He learned how to, at least nominally counterpunch a little bit with a little bit more consistency.
I
But
love
he's
hearing
also
and failed to be complimentary of Woodley.
Yeah, I know. But what I was gonna say, here's the rub, is that like in Woodley's losses, he's been pretty comprehensively embarrassed in all of them. Like they've all either been super, super one-sided, or he's just looked completely inert. And so you have like, well, I guess the one exception is the Nate Marquardt fight, but that was like early in his career, and he actually kind of went to war with Marquardt in like the last exciting fight that he ever had.
That was the fight
Um,
that convinced Woodley that he should no longer do things.
Exactly. That like he took a beating in that fight and he was like, okay, I don't want that to happen again. I'll just do nothing. But if you look at like this is what always bothered me, and I'm sure Ryan the same way about Tyron Woodley when he was at the top, is that you can look at a fight like when he fought Jake Shields, and Jake Shields couldn't do anything to him, but he just stayed in his face. He just kept locking up with him and just kept trying to push Woodley up against the fence, like no matter what came back at him. And I realized that the decision is arguable, but what was
The
not
decision
arguable,
is complete and utter bullshit, but it was
Woodley
also a fight that Woodley should not have gotten robbed in.
and Woodley looked awful in that
Yeah,
fight. It must be said, like he looked terrible. And then he fought Roy McDonald, and Roy just completely shut him out. And
that
then
decision wasn't bullshit.
no, it was a good decision. And then he fought Kamaru Usman, who did a lot of the same types of things. Like
And Usman like 50-24 him.
in his losses, they've all been crazy one-sided, and like the problem with like looking at his opponents, like when he fought Stephen Thompson or when he fought Darren Till or Damian Maia, like these fighters were not, for whatever reason, they just couldn't ask Woodley the same types of questions, and it allowed Woodley to look, functional. But the thing is that we've all seen Woodley's style pretty comprehensively solved a couple of times, and that was, I think, one of the reasons that we were always bothered by Woodley is that people would always profess that, oh, he's such a smart fighter, like, oh, he's improved so much. And I think the question is like, has he? Like, what has he really shown? Like, how many different flavors has he really? Flavors is a terrible word for that. How many different looks has he given his opposition since that Rory loss that leads me to believe that he would win a different kind of matchup?
I think you're hitting on another important point here for prospect development, and that's like how much can we trust MMA camps and MMA coaches to be able to bring their fighter up in a sensible way? And like we talk a little bit about camps, like making the wrong decisions about fighter development, but even more than that, it's just there isn't really a clear path. If you look at boxing gyms and Muay Thai gyms, the best kickboxing gyms, all the other combat sports kind of have a much more concrete system that they can bring fighters up in. But MMA camps and coaches are kind of it's like a patchwork endeavor where it's a lot less certain and there's very much fewer rules, and they're kind of like a lot of them are kind of like almost learning as they go, it seems. I think part of this is because when you have a head coach of like a Muay Thai gym or like a boxing gym or something like that, they're super familiar with every aspect of the sport that they need to teach their fighter. But in MMA, you get a lot of like um, instruction that's spread out. So fighters they'll go to like striking classes and grappling classes. They'll have a grappling coach and a striking coach, and a lot of them probably aren't getting great instruction on how to link them together. But it's also because MMA is such a new sport that it's coaches haven't really been able to kind of develop a system yet and learn best practices for prospect development. So that's another thing. When you see a fighter coming up who you're like, man, this guy looks really cool. If he just learned to do this and he fixed this up, he could really be something.
Yep.
But you have to consider if the camp they're at is able to fix those things up, if they actually have the capacity. There's this Indonesian atom weight, I think he's like 105, that Kyle McLaughlin really likes, Aid Parmena, and he's only like 2 years into his career, and he looks great. He has a sick grappling game. He does a lot of cool like redirection passes on top, leg drags and stuff like that. He has a tricky kicking game at range. He's a really great submission grappler, but he's training at an Indonesian camp. And when I'm looking at him, I'm like, okay, this guy, he's like only 2 years into his career or something. He looks like he should be great. And he has all the athletic potential and all the skill potential to do that. And he's training at an Indonesian gym. So like I don't know if these guys will ever be able to teach him how to wrestle or like how to box or and that's something you have to consider. Um, Even the best gyms in the world, there's a lot of stuff they lack in. Like Jackson Wink is no longer one of the best gyms in the world, but if a prospect goes to Jackson Wink, like whenever I think we've talked about this a lot. We've been like, hey, this guy's going to Jackson Wink, and we like let out a collective sigh, like Tom Duquesnoy,
Yeah.
because
Or
you know that they're not.
Aaron Pico. Like that was
Because you
one too.
know, yeah, you just know that they're not going to get the skill development that they need. Um, Stuff like we were both concerned about Nazareth Hakprast going to TriStar
Hmm.
because aside from like some issues that TriStar might have where they produce fighters who are usually not comfortable in the pocket, and Hakprast relies a lot on that to win, but they're not really suited to develop pressure fighters. So you get all these like weird style mismatch with gyms and gyms that are just not suited to developing a particular skill set in a fighter. And it's really hard to predict if a fighter to be is going to learn how to win fights at a high level and how to shore up all those weaknesses.
Yeah. Um, so we've talked a lot about like some concerning patterns with prospects and like what, how the UFC really doesn't help that. Are there any prospects that you are genuinely excited for that you think like have the potential to make big leaps and that are early enough in their career that they could probably, end up making some waves? What do you think?
Most of the guys that I like in the UFC on that level are not really prospects anymore, like Ronnie Barcelos, Julio Arce. They're kind of starting to come into their primes. To look for like exciting prospects, I think you kind of have to look outside of the UFC a lot. Some of my
Yeah.
favorite prospects, I really, if you follow me on Twitter, you probably heard me talk about Ramazan Kuramagomedov. I'm super high on this dude. He's like, I think he was 19 when I first saw him. Let me check this out. But he's only had like 5 pro fights, I think. He fought in ACV against like actual good opponents in his first couple fights, which is surprising. Okay, he's Sherdog actually doesn't give an age, but he's really young. His first fight was in 2017, and then 2 fights after that, in his third pro fight, he fought Georgi Valentinov, who's 21-5, and this Georgi Valentinov guy that he beat has a win over a guy who fought in the UFC. So he's not like a very good fighter, but he's on the level that it's surprising a prospect is dealing with him that early in his career.
And experienced.
Yeah,
Well, that's a lot of experience. 26 fights.
absolutely. And Sakura Magomedov, super well-rounded. He has a decent takedown game. He's very good on top. He does a lot of that AKA style riding, where he'll like wrap legs up on the cage, use like knee mount, where he's like triangling their legs together and hitting them. The crossbody ride, where he has like one hook in on the cage and he's keeping their weight on their hands with his upper body. He's a shockingly good boxer. He has a really nuanced jab. He's great at using it to draw out counters. He has a good lead leg kicking game. He's super defensively sound, especially for somebody who's so early in their career. One concerning bit is that he's not a super athlete or anything. He's not a bad athlete. I'd say he's probably like mid or upper mid range in terms of athleticism, but he's honestly one of the most skilled young fighters I've ever seen. He fought on the Dana White Tuesday Night Contender Series against Jordan Williams and won a tough split decision. And Dana being Dana, of course, they're awful at scouting and they like don't really know what they're watching. So they signed like some dude who was doing flying knees and like getting taken down all the time until he got a random knockout. But I'm glad they didn't sign him because I think Kuramagomedov would benefit a lot from fighting more on the regional scene and not jumping into high level competition right away. Another guy that I really like is Hussein Shikayev. He's in ACA right now. He came up in their ACB Young Eagles promotion, which is like kind of a feeder league for ACB. He started fighting in 2016, so he's been fighting for professionally for 4 years. He's 22 years old. He's a really sick grappler. He has a great transitional game. Very solid wrestler, and he's really good on top. He did that Suluev stretch thing that Zabit and Aljamain Sterling hit in the same night, where
Oh yeah.
you're
Yep.
in back mount and when they try to base up, you grab the knee and turn it into a knee bar. He hit that in his last fight against Yurzan Estinov. His striking is less developed than his grappling, but he's not bad there. He has a decent understanding of the distance. He does a lot of the like feinting in and out. He has some good combinations in the pocket. Needs to work a little bit on his defensive awareness, but because he's such a good grappler and he's so good in transitions, I'm confident that as his striking comes along, he'll be able to use that to aid his grappling. I'm really excited for him. Another guy that I haven't watched too much myself, but I've heard a lot of good things about is Saladin Parnasse. He fights in KSW right now. He's a French striker. Luca Bourdon is really high on this guy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He's he's actually like I'm checking now and he's like 9 years into his pro career. So he's not like oh wait, no, I was looking at a different guy. He's 5 years into his career. Okay. So he already has wins over guys like Marcin Warzoshek, who fought in the UFC. He beat Ivan Butchinger in his last fight in KSW. And Butchinger he's famous for being the dude Connor knocked out before he got to the UFC. But he's a great fighter he's a great win for a regional fighter to have. His only losses are to like really, really good guys like Magomed Idrisov, Connor, obviously, and Kamzat Dalgaev, who's an 11-3 guy fighting an M1. So he only loses to very competent, solid fighters. And Parnasse, that was a 5-round fight too. So he's already getting some 5-round experience as the M1 champion. I think at 145 pounds right now. Yeah. From what I've seen of him, he's a slick striker, really nice leg kicks, does combinations into leg kicks well. He's a pretty slick counterpuncher and has a decent front headlock game. So that's a guy to keep an eye on. How about you, Danny? Who are some of your favorite prospects?
So the prospects that I'm most interested in, one of whom I think most people are probably familiar with him is Eric Silva. He
Almost
has
made me
just
spit out
shown
my water.
he's shown to be just a really consummate submission grappler. Great athlete. Honestly, his stamina is probably the thing that's been highlighted to me. Another one, another prospect who I'm actually just hyped about would be Brandon Thatch. Think he's got a really high ceiling. Um, just I feel like if he can just make a few tweaks to his chin,
As
um,
soon as he learns how to grapple, he's got it.
he
He's a
will
top
be,
five fighter
yeah,
right away.
you know it. No. So there are not many. I would agree about Ramazan Kurmagomedov. He had looked pretty fantastic from what I've seen. He looked very complete and very composed. One of the fighters is in the UFC who I'm going to call a prospect just because I don't really have any other way to phrase him, is Brad Riddell, um,
Yeah,
who I
I saved him for you to talk about because I knew you're a big
thank
fan.
you. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. Well, you got me interested in him. I didn't really know who he was before that. He the only thing that I'm hesitating to call him a prospect for is because he did have a 50 plus fight kickboxing career before he moved to MMA, but he's only
That's
like
just what
eight.
makes him such an interesting prospect.
Exactly. That is a lot of experience and high level experience. He went like 46 and 7. Like he did really well in kickboxing. He fought a lot of good guys. Um and I think he finished like I realized John Wayne Parr is a little old now, but I realized he fought him
A
twice,
little
I
old.
think. A lot very old. But I know he fought him twice and I think he ended up avenging one of his losses. But he has looked really, really sound in MMA. He looks like he's a great physical athlete, kind of a lot of, similar to Alexander Volkanovski. He may not be like the the Romero Cejudo type, but he looks like a very physically strong, durable, hits hard, um, kind of athlete who's just kind of a great career athlete that you look for. And the way he's adapted his striking game is really quite nice. He's got a great kicking game. His shifting footwork on the front foot is gorgeous. He almost knocked Mustafayev out cold with the first punch he landed. And he actually, what really kind of turned me on to Riddell is the fact that he went 3 rounds with Mustafayev, who is not a very structured fighter, but is an insane physical athlete, just a physical beast,
And a
and
grappler too.
a grappler. And he was able to fight off the takedowns for the most part. It was scrappy in certain places, but there was no doubt about who won, and Riddell outlasted him and just kind of battered him towards the end. Um, so I'd say he is definitely a top prospect for people to look out for. Other than that, I like what you said about Hani Barcelos. We've talked about him before, but again, he's kind of moving into that phase of his career where he might just be a finished product.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of him, but he's not really a prospect at this point.
The thing with prospects is that you never really know what you're going to get with them.
Hmm.
Like I I remember people, the Aaron Pico was like the talk of the town a few years ago, and then Bellator just hardballed him. It's like they played their hand with MVP too conservatively, and they're like, "Oh, you know what? That doesn't work. We need to we need to push this guy along a little bit better." And then he's just taken like what is it, 3 knockout losses, something crazy, and he's like our age. He's like 23.
Pico was
Um,
asking for it too, like he wanted to be rushed.
yeah, that's the problem. Like you need a camp to kind of pull you back in that regard.
Well, he
I
was
don't
with
know.
AKA, so like
Yeah,
they're
I mean, it's
if
honestly
they're
what you just
known for one thing, it's producing fantastic wrestlers, except for Luke Rockhold, and getting their fighters just breaking their bodies down, either
yeah.
through them getting hurt in fights or through them just like that training video where Kane is like desperately trying to
Oh
break
yeah.
his knee on the leg extension.
Oh yeah. So I don't have as many names on hand, but there's a couple to look out for. The thing that I always
Actually,
kind of
sorry,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
One guy I wanted to bring up that I forgot to mention was Dennis Kanikov. He's also an ACA. He's been fighting for 5 years, so he started in 2015. He's we were talking about process. He's a really put together fighter. He's he's mostly kind of like a pocket boxer kicker kind of guy. he'll do like slick punching combinations into kicks. He has a really nice lead leg kicking game. He does a lot of those lean back lead leg body kicks where you don't like take a switch like a Thai fighter. You just kind of lean back and kick their body right directly out of your stance. So you can use it to counter guys when they come forward and throw the right hand and take their elbow away from their body. He'll also do kickoff combination with his lead leg in really cool ways. So he'll throw like a 1, 2, 3 and then just step directly into the lead leg body kick. And he also has a really solid clinch grinding game. So his A game is that kind of striking on the outside boxing and kicking kind of stuff. And then if he needs to, if he's having trouble with a guy on the feet or they keep shooting takedowns, he'll dig underhooks and pin them to the fence and kind of grind them down and beat them up in the clinch. He's a solid grappler too. He has great clinch throws, very strong takedown defense. He can grip fight single legs on the cage. Has a strong understanding of positional clinch games like underhooks and everything. I described him as in our ACA lightweight article as like the Paul Felder of ACA, and I think he could turn into like a solid kind of top 7-ish lightweight kind of guy. I think he'd probably beat Paul Felder at this stage. Could see him beating Hooker too.
You just made me think of another name that it's worth saying. Is Rustam Karimov, who
Karimov is
is
amazing.
Karimov is fantastic. He is a bantamweight, and he is 8 years into his career. He's 14-0, 8 years into his career. I mean, he may not be a prospect, but he is definitely like, you should be making a run right now. Like, this is your time to make a run. He is a powerhouse shot wrestler, who is not only an insane in his ability to take guys down, but his ability to continue to take guys down. Like, there are some fights where he hits, like double-digit number of takedowns because he's just so relentless in how he shoots. I like that he can hit reactive shots. He can be proactive. He can shoot off of his kicks,
Yeah.
which is pretty cool. Don't see that
He
very
did that
often.
in his last fight against Francisco de Lima Maciel. And this guy he
Yeah.
beat, De Lima, is a really solid grappler. He's decent on the feet too. He's strong all around. He beat Oleg Borisov in the fight before he fought Karimov, who's really solid everywhere. Borisov's a strong boxer, good in the clinch, competent grappler, and De Lima outgrappled him. So he fights Karimov. Karimov like does some outside footwork stuff and then throws a body kick and shoots in off of it. So when Maciel eats the body kick and then tries to counter, he gets taken down and then just completely destroys him on top and then finished him a couple minutes into the first round by like punching past his guard and just wrecking him.
Yeah. He's got an insane, passing game. He's just a monster on top. He'll attack in transitions, but he's also just in like, static positions too. He's just relentless. So I mean, if he came to the UFC, I think that he would probably, there's a good chance that he could beat someone like Aljamain Sterling quite badly. I think he would probably wreck Corey Sandhagen pretty badly. There are obviously some tough fights for him. I think Cejudo would be hard. I think that Jan's difficult for everybody.
Yeah.
But
Except
like,
Cejudo.
yeah, right, exactly. But he is looking like a finished product ready to make a run. And as Ryan and I agree, he's just terrific. So, Rustam Karimov is going to be one of my picks.
I think with guys like Karimov, even if he is kind of a finished product and he's not a prospect at this stage, there's a lot of times when you see a guy compete in the UFC for the first time, they get a lot better and they start improving even if they're kind of past that stage. I think it was honestly like so much of a thing that when I was betting, I'd have a rule about being wary when I'm betting on guys who are making their debut. I think a big part of it is that a lot of them aren't able to train like full time and they make sure to put a lot more time and effort into their UFC camps. I don't know if that's as applicable to the top ACA guys like Karamov, Vartanian, Bogov, and all that, because
Yeah.
I think they're fighting at the level where I'm sure they're already taking it very seriously. But there does seem to be an effect where when guys start fighting in the UFC for the first time, they make improvements that they hadn't shown before. So we
There
could
is,
still see Karamov develop.
yeah. Before we wrap up, there's one more kind of topic I want to address with prospects, and that is prospect losses. because these can obviously come in a variety of different ways. You can get a guy, you can have Nasrat Haqparast just go out there thinking he's invincible, throw a dumb leg kick and just get deaded. You can have, Shane Burgos have a great competitive fight with a kind of a more experienced version of himself in Calvin Kattar, and then sort of get outsmarted at the end of it, and he did get knocked out in that fight. Um, you can have the classic, quote unquote prospect submission loss, where a prospect just kind of gets overconfident against a big, physical grappler. They get overpowered, they find themselves in a bad position, they just get tapped. That happened to it happened to Colby Covington, it happened to Kamaru Usman, it happened to Jose Aldo, happened
That's a
to
really common one.
happened to JDS early in his career. Oh yeah, happens all the time. Like there are a lot of like all-star fighters who have had rough runs. I think Jacare got knocked out in his first fight, and then he went on to have a very good
Against
career.
like Jorge Patino too, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was like just the kind of thing where you look back and you're like, how did that even happen? But it can. Um, I guess the thing to consider is like they can come in a variety of different ways. But for you, Ryan, what is your kind of scale for severity in terms of a prospect loss? How do you look at like, you know, Shane Burgos getting knocked out by Calvin Kattar, and how does that compare to like uh, Cody Garbrandt losing his title to TJ Dillon? I realize Garbrandt was a champion, but he was still young in terms of fights. Like, how do you evaluate prospect losses?
I think the ones that are probably the most heartening to see are losses like Aljamain Sterling against Brian Caraway, where he's really competitive and a lot of the stuff he's doing is working really well, but he just kind of needs to learn to be a little bit more, maybe they need to be more a bit more patient and not throw all of their stuff right away. Maybe they need to learn to pace themselves a little bit better. But there's just like some little lesson that the vet can teach them, even though they're not taking a lot of damage and are still competitive. Because if you look at the Caraway fight, it's a fight where you're like, okay, yeah, Sterling wasn't quite ready to just roll over him, but he's obviously going to be there, and those fights teach them lessons and help push them in that direction. Fights like Shane Burgos against Kelvin Kattar are, I think, close to that, but obviously a little bit worse because they take a lot of damage. Um, I think those kind of fights help their development a lot. Like you could see Burgos working to figure out Kattar, and he was making adjustments during the fight. And I think having an experience like that early into your career is very helpful for learning how to win fights at a high level. That learning that you need to make these adjustments and that you're not going to spark everybody out. But it has the obvious downside of taking damage. The worst, I would say, are losses that are just kind of revealing of like some massive flaw that you didn't know was there, like Curtis Millender just getting stomped on the ground by ZDS,
Yeah.
where you can kind of like, okay, I'm going to wash my hands of this guy right now.
Yeah. Um, I That's the thing. It's difficult to say because not all knockout losses are created equal either. You could have TJ Dillashaw getting caught just early by John Dodson's insane speed and power, and then he goes on to have a great, like TJ Dillashaw has a good chin. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's got to be said. Like it took an insane weight cut, and it took like an Olympian athlete to be the only other guy in his career who's knocked him out. Um, so you can look at that and be like, well, the loss didn't end up being that damning. But then, there's a lot of question marks with like Nasrat Haqparast now. Like the first the first punch that Drew Dober landed pretty much flattened him. I
I told
realize
you Dober was going to knock him out.
that was a good call. That was one of your better calls. I got to give you credit, my man. Um, the prospect submission losses, I think, tend to be on the side of the more heartening. I think because that just happens to so many people. You
Mm-hmm.
didn't take, if you're getting submitted, you probably didn't take a ton of damage.
Even guys who
Um,
are like who later become impossible to grapple in their careers still have those. So
oh
like
yeah,
you're not looking at those and being like, oh, he's weak to grappling. Like he'll get tossed around by everybody.
yeah. I mean, Conor McGregor had a couple, and that did end up being his, one of his big weaknesses as a fighter. But like, it wasn't enough to say like, oh, he's just got a completely exploitable ground game. Like that's just
Hmm.
take him down. That's all it is. Fight over. That's obviously not how it works. I
Yeah.
think a lot of times you kind of have to see how fighters pan out. I wasn't completely off the Cody Garbrandt train after the Dillashaw fight, the first Dillashaw fight, because it was he at least yeah, you know where this is going. He at least had moments of success and moments where he got to demonstrate like why he won the title. He's
It
still,
looked like it should have been one of those fights where like, okay, yeah, he had some success. He got figured out by a more experienced, smarter fighter. Now he can take those lessons and go back to the drawing board and learn how to be that more experienced, smarter fighter. He did not, and I'll let you
no.
describe.
Well, that's just it. It wasn't as he did get knocked down by a head kick and eventually finished, but like you can still look at it and be like, okay, he's still in the upper echelon of athletes in the division. He's been undefeated up until this point, and it took, and he had a good moment of success that he can probably build on. It was in the second fight, where all semblance of strategy and intelligence went completely just out the window.
It was the
And
tetherball game all over again.
it was the tetherball game. And the thing is that I've written an article on Cody Garbrandt in the past, but something that's interesting about him is that like as analysts, we sort of had to, or at least I had to kind of unlearn lessons from him as he progressively showed where he was at as a fighter after that Munoz fight. And you kind of go back and you look at these fights and you're like, oh, I see. You never really learned how to create your own engagements. You always had a tendency to just plant and throw whenever you felt like it. You don't have any kind of layered reactive defense. Like these are issues in your game that we may, sometimes to our detriment as analysts, that may not even realize are there until it's too late. And like that was, you sort of have to be, if it feels like Ryan and I are sometimes extremely critical of fighters and we're just hate everything and we just think MMA fighters are bad. Obviously we don't, but there is truth to how critical we can be as analysts. Like because in this kind of sport, you have to just be relentlessly critical with how you watch fighters because
Or else you
there
get
are
sad.
else you get sad, but also just because there are so many different kinds of fighters that it's hard to you kind of like I said, you need to see them against a bunch of different types of fighter before you can really, say for sure who a fighter is. Like Dustin Poirier. Like after the Holloway fight, Dustin Poirier looked like he was making a case as an all-time great lightweight. And then after the Khabib fight, it kind of felt like, well, he's just going to be really good at what he does you know, and probably not improve in the areas where he's weakest.
Yeah.
Uh, So, like if there's a reason for our negativity sometimes on Twitter and our, how critical we are, it's for that kind of reason because a lot like fighters are question marks until they're not, right?
Hmm.
Even fighters who we feel like we know really well can sometimes show up and be question marks. And so that's like as an analyst, if for the people who are trying to figure out like getting our heads a little bit like why we are the way we are when it comes to evaluating fighters, it's because you should never stop asking questions about fighters. Even fighters you really like, even fighters you think have, a lot of upside, you have to be you have to be thoughtful and you have to be critical and you have to be relentless with how you evaluate fighters. There's a reason
And
that we are the way we are.
and as the great Luque Wardon said, MMA fighters almost let Wonder Boy be the champion. So
That says it all.
how
Like,
great can they really be?
well, I don't know. I don't know if Luca said that. It was like the spelling was a little bit off there. Um, but yeah, is there anything more you want to add? Because I'm
I think
pretty
I'll
good on
wrap it up
this.
by talking a little bit more about Garbrandt. Cody's a really interesting case study because I mentioned earlier that those elite guys I think tend to be all right in the lower divisions because they're forced to go through a lot of like really tough matchups to get there. And even though like the hyper athletic prospects who burst onto the scene and like win a belt within 5 years, they usually have to develop that because they're fighting really good guys on the way up and they're kind of learning as they go. Garbrandt kind of didn't have to do that. Like he fought Brimage, Briones, and Tanquinho in his first three fights, and they're fine, but they're not people who are going to be threatening any elite guys with anything. His next fight was against Tomas Almeida, who was kind of in the same situation himself. Like he'd had 4 wins in the UFC over guys who were fine, but not much more than fine. And we weren't really sure where he was going to go at that stage. And Garbrandt beat him impressively, knocked him out in the first round. And then he got a shot to Kei Mizugaki, who he also knocked out in the first round. So he had one decision, or 2 decisions. No, it was just one against Briones. He finished everybody else on his way up. And the good fighters he fought were like, he finished them in the first round. And then he got Dominic Cruz, who he turned out to be a really bad matchup for. And then that was kind of it. Like the only genuinely elite fighter he ever fought was Cruz. So he was never in there with guys like Asuncao, Barao when he was still like on top.
Rivera
Even
would have been.
Faber.
Yeah.
Even someone like Uriah Faber, who's athletic enough to compete with him and isn't going to go away. And then he just gets thrust against TJ Dillashaw, and TJ figures him out and beats the piss out of him twice. So I think they did Cody a real disservice by not giving him matchups with veterans that could challenge him before he got into the stage where he's fighting elite fighter after elite fighter after elite fighter with no breaks at all. And I think there's a good chance he's kind of ruined now because of that.
Yeah. I wish there was like a prospect academy in the UFC, like some subset of fighters at like ranked like 15 to 8.
Yeah.
And you have to take like, you have to win like 4 times in a row. And then, those who do eventually like then we can be like, okay, you're ready to compete at the top level, instead of guys who just like skip the top 10 straight into the top 5 and then are just, they just lose fights that they're not ready for. So,
Yeah.
So
I think my phone's about to die, so I think we're probably
no
good here.
worries. Thank you guys for listening to this. I'm just gonna brand this as the Fight Site MMA
Yeah, we
podcast.
got like a full podcast out of this.
This is a bonus episode for you folks out there. Thank you, Ryan, for joining me on this. Hopefully we have you on again at some point.
For sure.
And for the rest of us, just please stay checking the Fight Site. More stuff is to come, and as long as this pandemic is still in play, we will be there to meet your every need. So thank you guys, and goodbye.